Okay, so we're looking at 9.4, factoring to solve quadratic equations, and basically we're in chapter 9, we're solving quadratics, and so we're going to be going back and looking at some of the stuff that we did in chapter 8, which is why we're starting with this section. And since we are solving by factoring, it's going to be very similar to what we were doing in the last chapter. So the first thing that you need to know is what is the zero product property. And the zero product property basically says if you have two numbers that multiply to 0, one of those numbers has to be 0, right? So when the product of factors equals 0, one or more of the factors must also equal 0. So if you already have the problem factored out, let me get my marker. If you already have the problem factored out like it is here, then all you have to do is take each factor, so each parentheses, and put it equal to 0, and then solve it. That'll tell you what would make that factor 0. So if I solve this, I get x equals -3 and x equals -2. And if I plugged in a -2 for here, for example, I get -2 plus 2, which is 0. That means anything times 0 is going to give me 0. If I plug in the -3 here, and -3 plus 3 is 0. So 0 times anything over here is still going to give me 0. So basically, either one of these will work because they'll set my product to 0. So let's do one more example of that. These two are already factored into my two parentheses. I'm going to take each one and put it equal to 0. And then I'm going to solve it. And since it is a quadratic, that means that we're starting initially with an x squared. That is why we have two solutions, or two roots, in other words. What we're looking for are the roots of the equation. And so that degree of the equation will tell us how many roots we have. And since it's an x squared, a quadratic, then we know that we have two roots, or two answers. Okay, so here we again put each parentheses equal to 0, and we solved it, and that gave us our two roots, or our two x's. Why don't you go ahead and try the next two? Remember to pause the video so that you can check your answer. Okay, so go ahead and check your answers. This one is very simple and straightforward. This one's a little more tricky because when you have them, one of them, you don't realize that this is a factor, d, and you do have to put it equal to 0 as well. So then, if that were 0, it doesn't even matter what's in here because this is going to end up being 0 anyway. So you do still have two answers here. One of them is just d equals 0, and then the other one you solve by putting it equal to 0. So here are our steps, okay? Now, what we've done up until now is step 3 and step 4. Step 3, set the factors equal to 0. Step 4, solve. Now we're going to take it a step further. We're going to start at step 2. We're given a problem here that's not factored out yet, so we have to actually factor this problem. So I'm going to factor into my two parentheses. My signs are plus minus. Factors of n squared are n and n. And the factors of 15 that's subtracted 2 are 5 and 3. Make sure you check. So 5n minus 3n is 2n, so I know I did it correctly. And now that was step 2, factor. Now I'm going to do step 3, which is what we just did. Put them both equal to 0. I don't need this parentheses. And then solve. So we're basically just adding a step. We're factoring it out instead of having it factored out for us. Now go ahead and try these two. Remember to pause your video so that you don't get the answer right away. Okay, go ahead and check your answers. You'll see that they were both factored into two parentheses, and then each parentheses was put equal to 0. In this one, you had a 3 in front of the b, so when you moved over the 2, you had to then divide by 3, which gave you 2/3, which is a little bit different than the ones that we've done. Okay, so now going back actually to our steps, you notice that we never did this step here, set the equation equal to 0, because it was already equal to 0, right, in every one that we did. But what if it's not? So what if it's not in standard form? You have to make sure that you put it in standard form. It has to be equal to 0. So I'm going to move this 18 over, and since I do want it in standard form, I'm going to put it at the end. So it'll be 4x squared minus 21x minus 18 equals 18 minus 18 is 0. So now I've set the problem to 0. So now I've got all 4 steps, right? Set the problem to 0. Now I'm going to factor into my 2 parentheses. Actually, my signs are going to be wrong. So I do my check, 3x minus 24x gives me negative 21x, and then I put each parentheses equal to 0, and I solve. Okay, so go ahead and try these 2 examples. Again, pause the video so that you don't see the answers right away. Okay, here are your answers. Go ahead and check. Make sure that you did that correctly. Remember that second problem is the tricky problem, because once you move over the 5D, you have to remember to take out the GCF, and then you've got that variable on the outside, so you have to put that equal to 0. So let's look at some area problems. So if you see in the first one, you have, I'm sorry, not in the first one. We're going to look at the second one. In the second one, you have an area of a triangle, which would be base times height divided by 2. And you're given the area here. So what you're going to do is you're going to plug these things in, the base, the height, and the area into your formula, which I'm going to use this one, base times height divided by 2. And this is what I get if I plug it in. Oops, didn't mean to scroll down there on you. This is what I get if I plug it in. X base times the height, x plus 3, over 2 equals 20, right? So I have to get rid of that fraction. I'm going to multiply both sides by 2. Sorry about that. And then once I do that, I end up with x times x plus 3 equals 40. And now I'm going to have to distribute in order for me to put it into standard form and to move the 40 over. So I'm going to go ahead and distribute the x, and then I'm going to subtract the 40 so that it is equal to 0. Now I'm where I needed to be to do my factoring, right? I'm going to factor into my 2 parentheses. Let's just get rid of this box. So I'm going to factor into my 2 parentheses, x plus 8, x plus 5, x minus 5 equals 0. Put each one equal to 0, and I get my answers. The thing is that this is an area problem, which means I can't have a negative side. That's not going to make sense. So my answer here is not going to be x equals negative 8. It's just going to be x equals 5. So the x equals negative 8 will give me a 0 for the factoring problem, but in an area problem, that doesn't make sense. So the only answer that I'll stick with is that x equals 5. So go ahead and try the other problem, which I'm going to put back for you to see, which is a rectangle. Take a few seconds to do that problem, and make sure you pause so you don't see the answer. Okay, so here's the answer to the area of the rectangle. Again, you have to put it equal to 60, which was the area. It's length times width, or base times height, so x times x plus 4. You're not dividing by 2 because it's not a triangle, it's a rectangle. And then we'll distribute, bring over the 60, factor, make your 2 parentheses, and put them each equal to 0. My answer is only the 6 because the negative 10 wouldn't make sense in the problem.